Welcome to GPOguy.com video training session number 100.6, Basic Group Policy Troubleshooting. In this session I'm going to walk through some steps that you can take to troubleshoot problems with group policy. I'm not going to get into looking at specific problems, but rather going to talk about techniques for tracking down issues within group policy. So let's go ahead and get started. What I always tell people is the first place to start with group policy troubleshooting is in the Group Policy Management Console. So as you can see here, I've got the GPMC up and loaded for my cpandle.com domain. And the first thing that I like to do is run a group policy results wizard against the computer that's having problems. Now, the Group Policy Results Wizard is it's what's called an RSOP wizard, or RSOP modeling or logging tool that lets you connect to a remote machine and collect WMI information from that remote machine that gives you information about what happened during the last group policy processing cycle. So Group Policy Results basically goes and collects information so that you can go and look and see, what kinds of issues a machine had during the last time it processed group policy. Now, the thing to keep in mind here is that only XP and Server 2003 systems support this RSOP data. So Windows 2000 unfortunately does not support it. There's a command line tool in the Windows 2000 resource kit called gpresult.exe, which is the same basic tool as that which ships with XP and Server 2003, and it emulates this RSOP information on Windows 2000, but it's somewhat incomplete in terms of the data that it provides. So ideally you're in an XP environment by now, at least on the desktop, and can use the group policy results capabilities and the RSOP capabilities in XP to be able to troubleshoot your problems. One note about the remote RSOP capability is that in order for it to work, you have to be able to connect to that remote machine using the DCOM protocol. That's what WMI basically uses to allow remote access to its data. If you've got Windows Firewall or other firewall products enabled on your desktop machines, if they cannot pass DCOM protocols, which are typically ports 135, ports 445, and higher level ports, then you will get failures connecting using the Group Policy Results Wizard. So let's go ahead and get started. I'm going to right-click the Group Policy Results Wizard node and run the wizard. And when I get to this point, I can actually select a computer and I can browse my domain if I want. I'll just type in a machine name that I know, which is an XP workstation. And I'll go ahead and click Next. One thing to note, you could, if I go back here, you have the option of displaying both computer and user data, user policy for a particular computer. If you choose, you can only just select the computer data, which would be any per computer policy that's delivered to this workstation that I'm trying to troubleshoot. So we ignore any per user policy and just show the per computer policy. But we'll go ahead and show both at this point. Now, what this is letting me do is select from a number of users that have logged on to this XP2 workstation and choose which one I want to return RSOP data for. So I'm going to go ahead and select this K. Meyer user, and now that it's got all the information it needs, I'll go ahead and run the wizard, and it's finished. And now what you see on the right here is a set of tabs for providing some useful information for troubleshooting group policy. This HTML report, I'm going to go ahead and just show all on it so that we can go through what the information is that's in this report. Starting from the computer configuration side, it provides some general information, which is the computer name, the domain that the computer's in, the site that the computer's in, and the last time the group policy was processed. Now if I go down here to the Group Policy Objects section, you'll see that it shows me the applied GPOs, which GPOs were applied to this computer. In this case, only one, the default domain policy, was applied. It's linked at the domain level, and this is its AD and sysvol version numbers. So using this information, at a glance I can see if, for example, there might be replication issues between the AD and the sysvol portions of a GPO. If this sysvol number were 13 instead of 14, I would know that on this DC where this group policy was processed for this machine, that sysvol may not be up to date for its for the group policy information. And I could go off and investigate FRS replication problems using a tool like ultrasound from the Microsoft website. Now, down here it lists all of the GPOs that were denied to this computer, which can be just as important as the ones that were allowed or applied. And it gives, more importantly, the reason that the GPO was denied. In this case, you see here the local group policy object was denied because it's empty. Group policy objects that are empty, in other words, their version numbers are 0, don't get applied. Now, these two group policy objects are denied because their links are disabled. And the reason that we see a GUID here is that the computer was unable to read these objects. So not only is the link disabled, but it may also be permissioned in such a way that the computer can't actually read the display name of the group policy object, in which case it just shows the GUID. And then down here you see a group policy object called PMAS linked to the OU called workstations under the marketing OU in the cPanel domain, cPanel.com domain. And you see here disabled link is also the case for this. So the link to this workstations OU is actually disabled. And then finally, the SRP test GPO, which is linked in the same location, was not applied because it's empty. Now, the security group membership shows the groups that the computer was a member of when the group policy was applied. This is important because if you're filtering based on security groups, it's useful to know what groups Windows thinks it's a member of, this particular computer thinks it's a member of. As you probably know, if you add or change a computer objects, or even well, in this case, computer objects group membership, that group membership is not updated on the machine until the machine is rebooted. So this information can tell you if you're expecting, for example, a particular security filter to apply to a group policy object. This will tell you if you're not seeing that filter apply, well, maybe the user or the machine is not picking up this group membership yet. And then, if there are any WMI filters linked to this GPO, or to the GPOs that apply to this computer, then they would be listed here. In this case, there are not. Now we go down into the interesting part, component status. In this case, what we see here is for every group policy client-side extension that runs, we see when it ran and whether it ran successfully. Now, group policy infrastructure is a special component. It's actually what's called the core part of group policy processing. It's the part that goes out and looks for a domain controller, and then once it finds a domain controller, talks to that DC to figure out which GPOs apply to this particular computer, or if it might be the user in the case of the user. Whether or not those GPOs are applied or denied, and basically sets up the group policy processing sequence so that the various client-side extensions, which are represented by these here, EFS recovery, registry, security, software installation, can do what they need to do. It also shows the last time each of these processed, which is interesting because what you can see here is that even though group policy infrastructure processed at on 7/19 at 5:12 p.m., these particular client-side extensions haven't done any work since, well, the last one was on 6/20. So, in other words, nothing has changed in the GPOs that these client-side extensions are processing, so you know that they haven't done any work in a while. Now, if I keep going down here, I see some similar information for the user configuration part of the processing cycle. Again, apply GPOs, some general information, deny GPOs, group membership for the user when they logged on and processed group policy. And again, going down to component status, we see some more interesting information. In this case, we actually see that this folder redirection client-side extension failed. And it failed because the share is currently offline or does not exist. So it's basically saying that I'm trying to do some folder redirection to a folder on a server that doesn't exist or maybe offline. And it tells me that I can review the policy events tab in the console or in the application event log, and it gives me a time range where I could view that information. And if I'm referring here to this policy events tab, which I'll get to in a second. So what you get out of this summary tab is an overview of how group policy processing worked the last time it was processed. Did it work? Did it not work? Why didn't it work? In some cases, it will give you that information. So this is a very useful screen to start with when troubleshooting group policy. Now, the second tab, the Settings tab, actually shows you what the effective policy is for both computer and user, and which GPO provided it. So you see here winning GPO. You get basically for each policy item, you get the winning GPO for that policy item. So from this screen, you can see not only if the policy has been delivered to the computer or the user, but you can also see which GPO is delivering it. And this is obviously useful information if you're trying to troubleshoot a setting that you don't think has made it to the machine because the system's not responding as it has, or if you've got issues with conflicting settings causing problems where one GPO is delivering a conflicting setting over another. So again, if I just go down the list, I can see for each of these different policy areas. Here you see I have a software restriction policy. The winning GPO is SRP test, and it shows me all of the settings for that particular software restriction policy. Now finally, what we have is the Policy Events tab. And what this is it's a filtered view of the application event log on this target computer, this XP2 computer. And it's filtered to show only group policy related events. So essentially what we get is a subset of all the application events within the application event log related to group policy. And if I expand the source field, you can see some of the names of these events. SCCLI is actually the security client-side extension. UserEnv is typically part of the core processing cycle. So whenever I see a UserEnv event, I know it's probably part of the initial processing of group policy. And this particular one actually shows an error. So if I open it up, I can see that the error is Windows cannot determine the user or computer name, group policy processing aborted. So you see right here that for whatever reason, and typically this particular error results from either network problems or DNS problems, or in some cases the machine account is no longer trusted to the domain, and the machine account's secure channel has been corrupted, and so the machine's not able to go and query its domain location in AD. Or the user in the case of user policy. If I open up one of these SCCLI events, you see it tells me that security policy processing was successful, or security policy in group policy objects has been applied successfully. And if I go down here to application management, changes to software installation settings were applied successfully. So it's basically telling me a bunch of things that have gone on in the past specific to group policy. And down here you see a number of UserEnv errors on 6.1 that probably relate to various problems or whatever the state of these machines happen to be at the time. And you see all the errors are the same, and they're basically telling me that the group policy software installation client-side extension failed to execute. User init errors often come up when logon scripts or machine startup scripts don't run. And there are any number of reasons why scripts don't run. Unfortunately, the scripts area is not very well logged, such that it can be difficult to troubleshoot script problems. Okay. Let's say that you have gone through GPMC's Group Policy Results Wizard and you still can't figure out what the problem is, the next step that I recommend to people, and the last thing that I'll talk about in this session, is using the UserEnv.log file that gets created on a workstation or on a server whenever you enable it and whenever group policy processing occurs. The UserEnv.log file is a text file that gets created. If you turn it on, it gets created and logs very detailed information about group policy processing. What I typically do, and in this case I've done it on the default domain policy, is I've loaded up an ADM file, a custom ADM file that I wrote, and it's called gpolog.adm, and it's this. If you go out to my website and go to the tools page, it's this GPO logging ADM file, and this ADM file adds a number of policy items related to logging that you can use to enable on all the machines in your domain. So in this case, I have it linked to I have that ADM file loaded up into my default domain policy, and if I open up the GP editor on that, you'll see these policy items or these logging items enabled. In this case, I've enabled the verbose UserEnv processing or UserEnv logging for all machines in the domain. So I've got that enabled. That's the first step that I need to do in order to get the useful data out of UserEnv.log. Now what I want to do is I'm going to go over to my client machine, and I'm going to go ahead and open up the C Windows Debug User Mode folder, and this is where these UserEnv.log files get stored when they get processed. And as you can see here, I have a number of files with back extensions and a UserEnv.log file. This is the main log file. What I'm going to do here, for the purposes of my testing, is I'm going to go ahead and rename this file to UserEnv.log.temp1. That basically wipes out this file, or creates, there's no longer a UserEnv.log file in this directory. Why I did that is because the UserEnv.log file is used by both group policy and user profile processing. And because of that, it can get very verbose. And it can have a lot of data in it that's not relevant to your group policy troubleshooting cycle that you're trying to troubleshoot. So what I do is I rename that file so that it will create a new one. And then I go ahead and write and do a GP update. And in this case, I'll just target it to the user because the user was what was having problems. And when I go ahead and do this, it's going to go ahead and create a new UserEnv.log file. And you'll see that show up right here. And the policy cycle has refreshed. Now, if I go in and open this UserEnv.log file, what I get in it is only group policy for this particular cycle. So you can see here it says starting user group policy background processing, and background is basically indicating that I'm running it using GP update, or it could have been a natural background refresh. You can see here though that it's showing me that the process name GP update ran. And then it starts with the tests that group policy does, adapter speed. This is the basically slow link detection. So it's showing me that the first time I ran this, it exited with a fast link. So slow link is not an issue. The information you see here on the left is somewhat cryptic. These two numbers here, this is the process name, and this is the thread ID of that process that this is running under. In most cases, that 1A4, if you were to convert that to a decimal number and go and look in Task Manager, that's most likely the WinLogon process. This is just telling me that this particular processing cycle is executing on thread number 300, and it gives me the timestamp, although it doesn't give me the date stamp. In this case, it goes out and it resolves the user. I'm the administrator in this case, and it tells me which domain controller I'm connecting to get policy. It's giving me some data about RSOP, which is typically not that relevant, and it reads the previous status for each of the group policy client-side extensions, and then it starts to search out all of the GPOs that need to be processed, and you see that down here. It's searching the domain first, and then it goes and searches for the site and then OU and then local GPO. It tells me here that the local GPO doesn't contain any data since the version number is 0. And then it starts the client-side extension processing. And as each client-side extension is processed, it tells me whether or not it's doing something. So what it says here, when it says the lists are the same, that means that the list of GPOs and their version numbers that processed during the last cycle is the same as what's in AD currently, and so it's not going to do anything. And that basically tells me that each of these extensions is not doing anything because the lists are the same. And as it goes through this process, you can see in much detail a lot of the things that each group policy part of the group policy phase is doing. And in some cases, if there are problems, you'll see those problems show up in this log. Another useful piece of information that this log provides is it will tell you that the next refresh will happen in 108 minutes. So it actually calculates that next background refresh rate and puts it in this log file so that you know when it's going to happen. Okay, so that's basically my basic introduction to group policy troubleshooting. I talked about using the GPMC and the group policy results wizard to get basic information about what's happened during the last processing cycle. I talked about using the GPO log.adm file that I created to enable more verbose logging on client machines within your network. And then I talked about how you can use the UserEnv.log file to figure out what's happening in your environment. Thanks very much for listening.